The agenda today will be as follows. After the introductions, we will start with the panelists, both professors Panizza and Hausmann will be presenting the findings. I think that they will allocate the time between themselves. The findings of the paper, presenting it to us, because the paper has been written, and unfortunately, some people don't usually have always the time span to focus on the key findings, and that's why it is important to rehash and present the pillars and the key foundations of the paper. And then we will ask the discussants to have their own interventions. Each one of them will have 5 to 7 minutes to discuss their own views about these findings and to have their own perspectives and look at aspects maybe that have been overlooked or that have been looked into these papers. After the discussant's intervention, Professor Hausmann will have the opportunity of having a second clarification about whatever has been raised by the discussants. And then we will start reading some of the Q&As that we have received, and we received some good number of Q&As from the participants in the seminar. And throughout the seminar, we will have a poll questions that will be sent to all the participants. We will be conducting a survey to see what is the reaction of the audience about few particular and specific issues. Some of them have been posed by many in the questions that have been submitted, which is good. That means that everybody is converging towards the same subjects. So finally, I would like to encourage you to have a thorough, objective, and constructive discussion today. Thank you, and let's have a productive session. Professors?
Thank you very much, Karim. So I will start, as you mentioned, with a quick presentation of the paper, and then we'll move on as planned. I would like to share the screen. Share. Can you see my presentation? Can you see my presentation?
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Very good.
It's clear to everybody.
Okay, fantastic. So as Karim mentioned, this is was an effort of a large group of researchers. So we wrote this paper, 9 people, which is actually was a big, interesting way to work, coordinated by Ricardo. We had several drafts, we exchanged ideas. So here you see the list of authors. I'll do the presentation. Ricardo is also here, but we did this all together. As you can see, most people who contribute to the paper are based at Harvard, but I'm based in Geneva, and we also have somebody based at the London School of Economics. Let me tell you a little bit how we approached this paper. So we clearly, many of us, Ricardo and Carmen especially, have immense experience in dealing with financial and economic crises all around the world. And so we thought that while we don't have the specific day-to-day knowledge, then people actually who focus and only work on Lebanon have of the Lebanese situation, we could maybe present a view which is based, as Karim said, on our knowledge of how these financial crises played out around the world and how they were solved. And I think there is some advantage in combining people who have a precise knowledge of the facts on the ground in Lebanon, like Nicolas and Nassib, and our perspective, which is more of an outside perspective, but informed on the knowledge of dozens of economic crises around the world. And the way, so you mentioned pillar, Karim. So maybe the way to think about this paper is think about Lebanon as a house that has collapsed, and now we need to rebuild it. And the paper really focused on what should be the structure of the house, what are the main pillars on which the new Lebanon should be based on. And then there are many, again, if you want to keep the analogy with architecture, there are many architectural details in which can discuss, but here we're really going to focus on the main structure to build a strong and resilient economy. Before I get into it, let me just give a disclaimer. So the paper was circulated more than 6 months ago. So some of the data has changed a little bit. For consistency, I will show you the data that we have in the paper. Again, there have been some small changes, but they're not very important, and they don't alter the basic story and our basic policy recommendations. So let me start with facts. You all know these facts, but let's start so we agree on the facts. So Lebanon has been suffering a massive triple financial crisis, which is among the worst that we have observed in recent and even past history. So there's been a currency crisis, a massive currency depreciation of 98%. There is a banking crisis. People have not been able to access their deposits for more than 4 years, since October 2019. There is a sovereign debt crisis. The government is in default since March 2020. And these all are compounded in a massive economic crisis with real GDP contracting by nearly 40%. This has started more than 4 years ago, and no real action has been taken since then. And this inaction is making the things worse and making the life of the Lebanese people worse. So we need a rapid resolution that addresses all the dimensions of the crisis, and that's what we're trying to propose in our paper. And before I go into this, there is something, so all crises have common factors. One thing that is unique, we think, in Lebanon crisis, the Lebanese crisis, that it is the only banking crisis we know of in which most bank assets are deposits at the central bank. So we always think that putting the money at the central bank is the safest possible thing. And you have banking crisis because banks, do bad loans or do various different things. And here is a banking crisis which in part originates from problems in the central bank. So quickly, and then I'll go with more details later on, our recovery strategy is based on 4 pillars. The first one has to do with the monetary regime, and we're proposing to move to official dollarization. We'll provide some arguments for this. The second one is to rapidly, and here the emphasis on rapidly, rebuilding a functioning banking system. And here it's probably the most complicated thing. And we have a proposal which has to do with converting bank deposits at Bank to Liban in what we call restructuring certificates, then exchanging these certificates for deposits, and then recapitalize the banking system. I'll provide some details in a few minutes. The third pillar is to reestablish fiscal sustainability so that Lebanon can have a working government. And finally, to think what's the new economic model for Lebanon? Where can we find sources of growth so that the Lebanese economy can grow? I will focus most of my presentation on point 1, point 2, and a little bit of point 3. I will not talk much about point 4, not because point 4 is not important. In fact, in the long run, it's incredibly important, but just because point 1, point 2, and point 3 are the most urgent. So before I go into our solutions, let me just present quickly what is our diagnosis? How did we get there? And again, there are many things which we could highlight, but I'm going to focus on 2 things. The first one is the weak fiscal position of the country, which was partly originated with the need to finance the reconstruction of the country after the civil war, and a bad R minus G. So R minus G means the difference between the interest rate paid on government debt and the growth rate of the economy. So let me spend a couple of minutes on this. So this is a complicated graph, but it shows two things. So the gray bars show the overall fiscal balance, so the difference between government expenditures and government revenues. And the blue bar show the primary balance, which is the fiscal balance when we do not consider interest payment. So as you can see, up to 2000, the country had massive fiscal deficits to the order of 20, 30% of GDP. Now, if you think about the Growth and Stability Pact in Europe, it allows deficit up to 3% of GDP. So here we had deficits which were 10 times bigger. And these were due both by large primary deficits. So the government was spending much more than it was getting in tax revenues, even without considering interest payments, and even larger deficit when we consider the interest payments. Starting from 2002, 2003, you see that blue bars are positive. This means that the government, if we exclude interest payment, was actually spending less than what it would get in tax revenues. So there was a primary surplus, but interest payments kept being very large. And so that kept increasing. So that's the first element. The second thing we need to think about when we think about the evolution of the debt to GDP ratio. So this is a ratio, so its evolution depends on what's on the top of the ratio in the numerator and what's in the bottom of the ratio. On the top of the ratio, there is the deficit, these figures that I just showed you. So these were large, so that would contributing to a growing debt. On the bottom of the rate, there is the growth rate of the economy. As long as the economy grows rapidly, the debt to GDP ratio can go down, even if we run big deficit. The problem is that there were many years in which in Lebanon, the economy was growing at a slower rate of what is just needed to finance the debt. So this is the difference between the growth rate of the economy and the interest rate that needs to be paid on debt. These green bars that you should see here in this graph is the difference between the growth rate of the economy and the interest rate paid on debt. When this difference is positive, when the green bars are positive, it means that the interest rate is higher than the growth rate of the economy, so that goes up. When they are negative, it means that the growth rate is higher than the interest rate, so the debt goes down. And as you can see, for most of the recent history of Lebanon, this green bar has been positive. It means that growth was not high enough to reduce debt. So that's the first thing. We started with large deficits and the economy was not growing enough to reabsorb the debt. And the second thing about Lebanon, and this is a bit peculiar about Lebanon, is that the way in which these deficits were financed was done in a strange way. Let me tell you a little bit about it. So if we look at the period that goes from 2002 and 2018, both the private sector and the public sector in Lebanon spent more than the income that they generated. And when you spend at a country, when you aggregate the private and public sector more than the income that you generate, you need to import money from abroad. You basically need to borrow from abroad. So this sum of the deficit of the public and private sector over this 16 years between 2002 and 2018 amounted to about $100 billion. You can see it here on this graph. And these $100 billion were about $57 billion, about 60% of a deficit of the public sector and about 43 billion of the deficit of the private sector. So both the private sector and the public sector needed money to finance themselves because they were spending more than the income that they were generating. How was the public sector financed? Well, the public sector was financed about half of it by the central bank. Out of this $57 billion, 29 were financed by the central bank. 14 billion were financed by banks, and the other 14 billion by other people. What about the private sector? The private sector ran a deficit of 43 billion, but even though the private sector ran a deficit of 43 billion, it ended up importing money from abroad of $140 billion, so more than 3 times what it needed. So this is puzzling. So the private sector needs 43 billion, but it's getting from abroad about 140 billion, more than 3 times that. What did they do with the extra money? Well, it financed the government. So the government did not borrow directly abroad, but there was a system in which the private sector would borrow money from abroad and then lend this money first directly to the government, and then lending the money to the central bank, which then it would lend the money to the government. And if you look at the evolution of the situation, if you look in 2009, this is the financing of the government. About 50% were financed by bank, the blue line, and 50% by other agents. By 2018, the main financer was the central bank. And where would the central bank get the money? It would get money from the banks. And where do the banks get the money? It would get money from depositors. So depositors would put money in banks, banks would lend money to the central bank, and the central bank would lend money to the government. This is a bit of a trivialization of the story. Everything becomes more complicated if you look at the details, but that's pretty much what was going on. So this is a little bit of the background of the situation. How do we get out of here? So as I mentioned, we have 4 pillars and in our new house. And the first pillar is we propose full official dollarization. What is full official dollarization? Basically, Lebanon would no longer have a currency and adopt the US dollar as its own currency, like other countries have done. Panama has done this for a very long time, for more than 100 years. So any policy decision has costs and benefits. What are the costs of official dollarization? Well, in the moment you no longer you have a currency, of course you cannot have an independent monetary policy. So you give up one tool of macro policy. But Lebanon has not had an independent monetary policy for a very long time. With a fixed exchange rate, with a fixed exchange rate and an open capital account like Lebanon always had, you cannot have an independent monetary policy. So there will be nothing new in this sense. On the positive side, we would have a credible nominal anchor. Once there is the dollar, people believe in the dollar. Lebanon before had a fixed exchange rate regime, but clearly this was not credible. How you can see that it's not credible? It was not credible. You could see it from the fact that lira deposits were paying different interest rate with respect to dollar deposits. If the exchange rate, if the peg had been fully credible, these two type of assets should pay exactly the same interest rate. Not only it was not credible, it also allowed for what they became infamous financial engineering operation by the central bank, which actually contributed to the problem and made the crisis worse. Dollarization is good. Lebanon is part of a dollar area. Many of the countries in the Gulf, whom Lebanon trades with, have exchange rate pegged to the dollar. And so this would basically strengthen this participation in the dollar area, increase credibility, attract FDI, which is good. Plus, Lebanon is already de facto dollarized. People in Lebanon think in dollar. Any large operation is above, buying a sandwich is already in dollar. So again, nothing will change. So we envision this, a situation in which Bank du Liban no longer issue currency, but only as a regulatory role. So that's the first step. The second one, and the one might be more complicated. So I spent some time on this. I assume there will be, most of the discussion will be on this, but let me tell you something about this. So fix the banking system. So let me start again with some facts. You cannot have a modern economy without a functioning banking system. So you cannot have economic growth. Your situation cannot normalize unless the banking system is fixed. So we know this. In every country in the world, you need a working banking system. In the banking system, most of the dollar liabilities, so on the liability side of the banks are bank deposits, so money that people put in the bank. And most of the banking system assets are deposits in dollars of the central bank. And the central bank does not have enough dollars to honor these deposits. There is a hole. You can, again, 1 billion more, 1 billion less, but there is a hole in the balance sheet of the Bank of Lebanon of about $60 billion. And so we have a plan for fixing this. And it's a serious situation, so there will be some pain, but our plan consists of 3 steps. And we formulated this plan thinking about the fact that the central bank is actually part of the public sector. And so let's think about the Bank to Lebanon and the government as the same thing. So the first step in fixing the banking system, we would like to transfer $76 billion of Bank to Lebanon liabilities. So these are deposits of the banking system into Bank to Lebanon, transform them into what we call restructuring certificates. If you want to give them another name, these are government bonds. So now these $76 billion are no longer a liability of Bank to Lebanon, are a liability of the government. And then we transfer these restructuring certificates, these new bonds, to the banks. So now banks no longer have assets with the central bank, but banks have assets with the government. This will have the advantage of leaving the balance sheet of Bank to Lebanon much smaller and with positive equity. So this will make Bank to Lebanon solvent again with a $14 billion equity. And banks now will have direct claims on the government. So that's the first step. So what is the second step? Now we need to fix the banking system. And we are proposing that up to, and here calculations need to be made because one would have to look carefully at the balance sheet of the banks, but whoever has up to $100,000 in the banking system will get their money in dollars. So if I have $50,000, I'm going to get $50,000 and I do whatever I want with this $50,000. Of course, fresh money, the fresh US dollar account will be protected. So even if I have $1 million in fresh US dollar, this will be left in real dollar. Now, whoever has more than $100,000, $150,000 will receive for the amount above $100,000 restructuring certificates for the same face value. So let's assume I have $200,000 in the bank. I'm going to get $100,000 in real dollars, and I'm going to get a restructuring certificate worth $100,000. So in a sense, my claim, I had $100,000, I still have $100,000 in the bank, and now $100,000 I have a claim in the government. This will affect a large amount of deposits, but given that there is the number of depositors with large amount in the bank with more than $100,000 is relatively small, it will affect a relatively small number of depositors. Next, the final step, recapitalize the bank. We envision a system in which banks have a fairly high capital ratio, 15%. Some banks will come out from the previous step with not enough capital. If they don't have enough capital to satisfy this 15% ratio, they will receive a subordinate loan from the central bank. So banks are fully capitalized and they can operate from day one, but this is not free money. Bank shareholders that receive this loan to recapitalize their bank will not be able to pay themselves dividends, and they will have to fully pay back this loan within 2 years. And if they don't do this, then the banks is taken over and shareholder will lose their equity in the bank. So what are the advantages of this plan? The central bank will come out with a credible balance sheet, and Bank deposits will be backed by credible assets in the Banque de Lebanon. Banks will have clean balance sheets as well, and they will be able to resume credit operation and sustain the economic recovery in Lebanon. There are many challenges and complications. How do we deal with people who exchange money after October 2019? How do we allocate the distribution of restructuring certificates? How do we fix the threshold above which deposits become restructuring certificates? Legal people versus individual accounts. People who have assets and liability in the bank, how do we net this asset and liability? And of course, very important, how we avoid corruption, how we may avoid that people try to game the system. These are all challenges and real challenges that need to be thought hard about. We have some discussion in the paper, and we can go there if you want. The third step is to restore fiscal sustainability. And here, this step is really consists of two steps. Step number one, we are going to need a massive debt restructuring. After the second step, after fixing bank balance sheet, the government will have a massive debt. The original Euro bonds plus the restructuring certificate. This will be a massive share of GDP. And so this will need to be restructured. We run some simulation, and depending on how you put the numbers, we get that this debt of the government will have to be cut by 80 to 90%. I think the last time I looked at the Euro bonds, they trade at 7 cents on the dollar. So the market is pricing a 93% haircut. And this will have to be done with the help of the IMF, which would provide transition financing to the program. And if the IMF is happy, they could lend to Lebanon large amounts. So in case of Argentina and Greece, they lend 11 times the quota. So there could be, one could make the case for exceptional financing. And then we have a plan for restructuring the fiscal system, which has to do with increasing the VAT, to adjusting the income tax, reducing exemption, increasing public, so it's not all cuts. We think that public sector wages need to go up so that people have the right incentive, a better allocation of energy subsidies, restart investing in the economy with infrastructure. So that's the third step. And then, of course, the fourth pillar, and again, I don't want to talk too much, so this I'm going to go over in like less than 1 minute. We have to think about how to restart growth. And here, the Harvard Growth Lab is called Growth Lab, so it's immense knowledge about this. And we have identified that for the case of Lebanon, there are really 4 things we need to focus on. One is to valorize high value added agriculture within Lebanon. The second one is tourism. Lebanon has an amazing untapped potential here. The third one are knowledge services. We already know Lebanon has already some amazing firms, for instance, in engineering, architecture, which have export to the rest of the world, but much more can be done. And we have a discussion in the paper how the diaspora, the Lebanese diaspora, which is all around the world, and it's a very skilled and in some cases wealthy diaspora, could help in these 3 activities. And again, we have a discussion in the paper. We discussed also a little bit natural gas. We think that it's an opportunity. We don't think that this is going to be the panacea that is going to solve the problem, but of course, it could help if managed well. So let me stop here. So 4 pillars, new monetary and foreign exchange rate regime, which is dollarization, banking and debt restructuring, clean up the balance sheets of Banque de Lebanon and clean up the balance sheets of the banks, strong fiscal framework. It needs to start with a massive haircut and then measure to improve the fiscal balance and then invest in new sources of growth. So I'll stop here. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Hugo, for a very comprehensive review of the 4 pillars of the paper. which I would like to keep on repeating throughout this webinar, that this is neither a lawyer investment bank hatched plan, nor is it a panacea or a magic wand. This is a framework. This is a guideline book for people to look at these pillars, and then they can decide and tailor whatever is acceptable at the local level. And talking about the local level without having the local thinking, I would like to turn to the first discussant with us, Dr. Nassib Ghobril. If you would like to come, you're not on the clock, but we've allocated 5 to 7 minutes. So if you would like to be within that time frame, we would appreciate it for the patience and the time of the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karim, and thank you, Professor Panizza, for this comprehensive presentation of a 70-page report, very concise and to the point, and I will try to stick to the time frame. I read the report with great interest from the beginning, and I had certain questions that were clarified by the authors. But I still have some agreements and some disagreements with the content of the report. The first point is how we got there. That's true. All these figures on the public debt and the fiscal balance are definitely accurate, but these are the results. These are outcomes from the real sources of how we got there, which for me are two main points: the abuse of political power over the years and the mismanagement of the public sector. And if you look at the governance indicators of the World Bank, you see Lebanon on the 6 indicators: effectiveness of the government, rule of law, regulatory quality, control of corruption, voice and accountability. We're at the bottom third of 215 countries and jurisdictions around the world. And that's for the past 20 years. It's not recent because of the crisis. And that has deteriorated over recent years, but that's been ongoing. And there are many examples of the abuse of political power between March 2013 and September 2021, for example. You had 8.5 years. During that period, successive governments have been able to function only for less than 1/3 of that time, 2 years and 8 months. 11 months to form the government of Prime Minister Tamam Salam, 2.5 years of presidential vacuum, 8 months for Prime Minister Saad Hariri to form his government, 13 months to form the current government in place, and that's only between March 2013 and September 2021. And this has been ongoing now. We're 1.5 years without a president and 2 years with a government in a caretaker capacity. The mismanagement of the public sector is blatant, and the poster child of the mismanagement of the public sector is the electricity sector, which has consumed $25 billion in treasury advances, plus $20 billion in accumulated interest rates on these unpaid treasury advances, which was equivalent to 50% of the public debt. The increase in public spending by 160% between 2006 and 2018 without budgets, to the point that public expenditure reached 31% of GDP in 2018. That's the equivalent of the public expenditure of Qatar and Egypt, the largest gas exporter in the world and the largest Arab countries in terms of population. Very weak tax enforcement and compliance. 30% of the economy is an informal economy, according to national accounts. Recruiting 31,000 persons to the public sector between 2014 and 2018. Most of them don't have work, let alone job descriptions, and so on and so forth. So these are the real causes that led to the addiction of the government to borrow instead of reducing its expenditures and increasing its revenues. Breaches of laws such as the Code of Money and Credit, both from the central bank and the government side. So these are the causes of how we got there, in my opinion, and the rest is just results. The increasing cost of maintaining the peg, the widening fiscal deficit after the increase in the public sector wages and salaries for electoral purposes. We usually had deficits of $3 billion annually that were more or less manageable. That's not acceptable, but they were manageable. And then in 2018, after the increase in the public sector wages and salaries, it doubled to $5.8 billion and to 11% of GDP. And obviously, over the years, that led to the increase in the public debt. And I fully agree that if you have growth faster than the increase in the public debt and in debt servicing, then your debt to GDP ratio would slow down, like we've seen from 2006 to 2013. But then when economic growth slowed down, then the increase in the rate of increase in the public debt overcame the rate of increase in the economy. Now, regarding the solution, these are definitely out of the box ideas, because we have been hearing since the beginning of the crisis, or even prior to the crisis, a narrative that has been dominant in the media and that has been driven by populistic instincts about the technical roots of the crisis, with total neglect of the what I call the real sources of the crisis: the abuse of political power and the mismanagement of the public sector. And the narrative has been, the greedy banks wanted high interest rates and profits, and the central bank was doing financial engineering tricks, and all these people together led to the collapse of the economy and of the country, and everybody stole depositors' money. The authorities, I don't want to call the government, the authorities, it makes the authorities look like a distant observer sitting in an ivory tower in New Zealand that suddenly woke up in October 2017 and saw remotely a crisis in distant Lebanon. So this caricature of the crisis is on purpose, I think, is deliberate, to avoid assuming any responsibility on behalf of the authorities. And we saw this in an attempt to legislate this narrative through the banking restructuring law and the treatment of deposits that was dated February 18 of 2024 of this year, that put essentially the entire burden of the crisis on depositors and the banks, not just on the banks, on depositors and the banks, with no responsibility at all for the central bank or for the government to restore confidence and to participate in the recovery process. So when you call for these points, that's very refreshing, whether they are feasible or not, but this definitely opened the door for discussion, because through these points, it definitely spreads the responsibility to the state, to the authorities, to the central bank, and of course to the banks. There is no way the banks can avoid assuming a big part of the responsibility. First of all, when we talk about dollarization, yes, it is very important in terms of, we have a de facto dollarized economy, but to make it an officially dollarized economy, there are advantages, especially inflation, which the most recent reading of the consumer price index is 70% year on year for April 2024. And that's a decline. This is the first time it's in double digits since the beginning of the crisis. It has been on a monthly basis in triple digits. So that will definitely eliminate the problem of high inflation rates. But there are other problems. One of them is not the role of the central bank, in my opinion, because we have a big experience in front of us, which is the euro area. The central banks of all the euro area, of all the countries that adopted the euros, have transferred their monetary authority to the European Central Bank, and they focus on the points that you mentioned in the report, monitoring the banking system, lender of last resort, and so on. But the problem in Lebanon is political. It's not conceptual. As you said, as you know, the economy is almost more than 60%, 70% dollarized, in my opinion, and probably this is conservative, but there are no official figures to give a final estimate. So you have the political component. When you dollarize your economy, the dollar becomes your official currency, and you no longer print Lebanese pounds. That means you're directly, as you said, tied to the U.S. Federal Reserve. And you have political problems there, that you're relinquishing your sovereignty to the United States. And you have components in Lebanon who, for political reasons, and this is their right, think the United States is a hostile country, and you cannot link the country's monetary policy to a hostile country. For me, this is the main obstacle, and that's why I think it makes it a serious problem to have an officially dollarized economy. Now, to the second point, the banking sector, it's as I said, it does spread the responsibility fairly to the banking sector, to commercial banks, to the central bank, and to the state. The state is the side that spent all this money on various things, on recruiting 31,000 persons, on the fiscal deficits, on maintaining and increasing the expensive peg, on mismanaging the public sector. And until now, until this report, there is no responsibility whatsoever for the state to assume under any plan that was submitted, whether from the government or the other entities. So that's a fair way to look at it. The other fair way is that the central bank's contribution to the recapitalization of the banks, and with the bank's responsibility to pay after 2 years, and if they don't pay, then they will lose their shareholder. That's very fair. The problem is what happens after that is when you shift the interim certificates of the depositors to the state, and the state should assume this responsibility. But when you talk about a haircut of 80% to 85%, that's not palatable under any plan, whether the government's plan or variations of it. It does not pass. Every time there is an IMF delegation in Lebanon, and there will be one coming next week for 4 days under Article 4, they hear from the decision makers in the country, from Parliament specifically, which is the body that will have to legislate this plan, that there is no appetite for any haircut for depositors. You talk about $100,000 to $150,000 in guaranteed deposits. That's about $18 billion, $18 to $20 billion out of $90 billion in foreign currency deposits. So you still have almost 80% of the deposits that are not, I wouldn't say not accounted for, but they will be subject to the haircut. And even though they're large depositor, it doesn't mean that they should be penalized. The risk with all the approach so far since the beginning of the crisis is that we have been fighting capital, we have been scaring capital, and Lebanon is an open market, free market economy that has been breathing free market principles and cannot survive when you scare capital away. So that part, I don't think it will pass. There is no political appetite to do a haircut of 80%, even on large deposits. The $150,000 deposit, if it's returned faster than the government's plan, the government draft law, which is over 15 years, would be a positive. But you cannot limit $150,000 and say the rest, basically indirectly, that the rest can be discounted or go through a haircut. And that's okay, because people have large deposits, they should be penalized. Most of these people have worked very hard for their money and placed it at the banks. And maybe some of them need to be identified in terms of asset recovery and the sources of the funds. But to penalize or to look like this approach is penalizing large depositors is very harmful for the economy. Now, regarding fiscal sustainability, I have news for you. The fiscal sustainability practically, unofficially, has been restored. If you look at the public debt, it used to be $102 billion prior to the crisis in 2019. Today, 60% of it was in Lebanese pound. If you convert it to the current exchange rate of 89,500, it goes down to $1 billion, to $1 billion only. If you look at the Eurobonds, the $31 billion in Eurobonds, and the historical mistake that the previous government has done by defaulting in the way it defaulted on the Eurobonds, and today, as you said, the value is about 7 cents to the dollar. Effectively, its mark-to-market value today is $2.2 billion. There's still $2 billion in bilateral loans that the government is servicing. So your total public debt today, based on the figures, is $5.22 billion. And assuming a recovery value for the Eurobonds of 25%, not 15%, as some investment banks have forecasted, that would make the public debt $10.8 billion, which is equivalent to about 49% of GDP, based on a $22 billion GDP as estimated by the IMF for 2022. For the public finances have recovered, even though the Ministry of Finance has not been able to publish fiscal figures since 2021. This was the last year they published full figures. But since it started collecting taxes and fees at the rate of 89,500 and in fresh dollars and in cash Lebanese pounds, it has posted a fiscal surplus in 2023 of 0.5% of GDP and a primary surplus of 1.6% of GDP. And its revenues have increased to 15% of GDP in 2023 from 6% of GDP in 2022, according to the World Bank's estimates. So in terms of who benefited the most from the crisis, so far I can see it's the public sector that has benefited the most, at least public finances, not the public sector. Now for the last point, which is the sources of growth, no, this is a very important point. It's a crucial point, because just like you look at the governance indicators and see where we rank in the bottom third of every one of those 6 indicators, we ranked in embarrassing positions on the ease of doing business survey of the World Bank before it stopped and before the crisis in 2018. 75% of countries around the world and 60% of Arab countries had a better business environment than Lebanon. Lebanon, the oldest free market economy in the Arab world, 60% of Arab countries had a better business environment than Lebanon. If you look at the Global Competitiveness Index of 2018 and 19, also about 60% of countries around the world have a better competitiveness than Lebanon. And if you look at the components of both indices, you see that these are man-made problems. These are not something imposed on us from anywhere. And it's not a conspiracy. These are man-made rankings, should we say. And regardless of the sources of growth, if you improve, we need to improve the investment climate and the business environment and raise the competitiveness of the economy and let the private sectors create jobs, attract investments, and grow the economy. And in this case, I go back to the debt to GDP ratio, who was at 186% of GDP in 2006. And because of some proper fiscal management at the time, and an average GDP growth rate of 9% between 2007 and 2010, which was unsustainable anyway. The debt to GDP declined to about 35% of GDP by 2012, 2013. So if we improve the business environment and the investment climate and respect the constitutional deadline and implement our laws and respect separation of powers, and look at the problem not as a loss restructuring exercise, but as a liabilities management exercise, and look at the growth, how to grow the economy, then we will regain confidence. Instead of this gloomy image of we need to write off deposits and haircuts and penalizing deposits and penalizing the private sector in general, and changing the identity of the Lebanese economy in the process to something alien to Lebanese culture.
Thank you, Dr. Ghobril. I will not hold you accountable to the time because you've surpassed your allocated time, but that's okay. You went into Lolar on the time, but you stayed on the dollar in your intervention. Thank you very much. Now we have Nicolas Chammas, who's going to give us another perspective. I just want to say one word, is that some of the points that have been raised by Dr. Ghobril in his intervention, we will take them again in our Q&A, because some of these issues, be it the responsibility of the government, the dollarization, the level of threshold of recovery for the deposits, etc., have also been recurrent in the questions that have been posed by the attendees. So without further ado, we are waiting for Mr. Chammas.
Thank you, Karim, and thank you, Ugo, for your thoughtful and comprehensive presentation. In the interest of time and to try to respect my allotted 7 minutes, I will just focus on pillar number 2, which is the financial and banking sector reform, and try to avoid all the points that have been tackled already. I just wanted to say that the much needed and long awaited and overdue reforms for financial recovery have been going nowhere since October 17, 2019. But I think that 2 recent developments are worth mentioning, as they are, in my view, potentially game changers. The first one being a recent ruling by the Lebanese state court, the Conseil d'Etat, which has struck down a government decision dating back to May 2022, whereby it authorized the central bank not to repay a large chunk of its dollar deposits to the commercial banks, and hence that was a huge threat to the depositors' money. The second major development is the Harvard report that we are discussing today. Well, I happen to think very highly of it, not only because Harvard is my alma mater, but because I think it is very compelling, and I will just say why in a couple of minutes. Let me just say that what the two developments I mentioned have in common is that they place the responsibility where it belongs, and they hold the state's feet to the fire, which is something excellent. And now, as General Secretary of the Lebanese Economic Organizations, which is the employers, umbrella organization here in Lebanon, I would say that we do welcome the Harvard report, and I already defended it fist and nail on TV and elsewhere. Let me just say that it is bold yet applicable. It is fair but still decisive, and it paves the way for a sustainable and V-shaped recovery, which we are all after. And actually, there are many points of convergence between the roadmap, the financial roadmap that we as economic organizations and yourself have presented. And I will just dwell on a few of these convergence points. The first one is, since this is an unprecedented crisis, all off-the-shelf solutions like Lazar style or IMF style will not fly. What is needed here is out-of-the-box thinking. Second, this is a systemic crisis, and the government day and night tried to work to convince people that it is not a systemic crisis, it is a crisis between a bank and its depositors, which is completely false. Thirdly, we need a comprehensive approach. As Ugo mentioned early on, it is a triple problem: banking and financial and monetary. And hence, we need something comprehensive and far from the piecemeal approach. Fourthly, we can say that the insolvency of the banks comes from the insolvency of the central bank and not the other way around. Fifthly, I would like to say that the fingerprints of the state are present everywhere on or in the financial crime scene. And the responsibility goes back to before and after October 17. Before October 17, of course, the peg that was unfunded because we had not enough dollars to go around. Second, the electricity problem, which drained our national resources. And thirdly, the public servants' wages. As for after October 17, we had to deal with not only a default, a disorderly default for that matter. Second, subsidies that were ill-conceived and ill-targeted because 75% of them went to the wrong places. And thirdly, because the private debt has been extinguished at much lower exchange rates, which has depleted to a large extent bank assets. So the responsibility is there, and the liability should be there. In the same sentence, when one thinks and speaks about responsibility, we should talk about liability. Unfortunately, the state did not shoulder its responsibilities and liabilities, although it had a formal way to do that, because in the law of money and credit, and precisely Article 113 mandates, it is mandatory here, and obliges the state and precisely the finance ministry to bridge any deficit and to recapitalize the central bank every time it goes in the red. Unfortunately, in the past several years, it did not do that through this pay-as-you-go, if you will, scheme. And the day of reckoning has come all at once. And the chicken have come home to roost, unfortunately. So I agree with the Harvard plan that we need to take the insolvency and move it back from the banking system, meaning BDL, and the commercial banks back to the state itself. And here, there is also some crookery and some fraud in the terminology itself, because the state always talks about distributing losses. The thing is, there are no such thing as losses. We are talking here about sovereign debt that has been accumulated by the state, and the money was ill-expensed, and we need to tackle this problem. Now, also back to what Ugo was saying about the challenges on, how to repay the depositors. First, of course, we have to recapitalize the banking system and the central bank, and I agree with this instant quote-unquote recapitalization that you are proposing. Second, we have to divide between eligible and non-eligible deposits, because not all deposits in dollars have been created equal. This is unfortunately the case. Today, as we speak, there are roughly $88 billion of deposits remaining in the commercial banks, and roughly speaking, 50% of them are eligible and 50% are not. And here I go back to your suggestions. First, everything that has been transferred from Lebanese pounds to US dollars after October 17 has to be, this process has to go back to 2.0, or at least with a large haircut. Second, any excess interest has to be clawed back. Third, all the deposits that have been split have to be remerged also. And also there are some unclaimed money or dirty money that cannot be explained. So this will reduce, if you will, the scope and the size of the problem. Now, the major part, and that I like most about the report, is that, through the interim restructuring certificates, whereby the large depositors will have a claim on the state itself directly. This is where the responsibility lies, and this is the way to go. However, and this is, if you will, the biggest reservation I have about the report, although I have agreed with 90% of it, is that it imposes a huge haircut between 80 and 90%, as you just suggested. As Lebanese economic organizations, we wanted to maximize depositors' recovery. This is why we have suggested that some of the state's assets be put to work, and actually to hard work, in order to optimize this recovery. And here I mean that we can regroup the state assets by sector: electricity, telecom, transportation, whatever else. They remain the property of the state. We change the governance. They are run maybe by a PPP or by the private sector alone. But and every dollar will go to the treasury. However, whenever a sector outperforms international business best practices, the excess will go toward reimbursing or funding the recovery of depositors. And this is here, Ricardo, because I know that you are going to talk first. This is one of my most important points. We need to assure that more money will be set aside for the recovery of the depositors' money. And I urge you to consider this. I had talked to Karim about it earlier on. This is, in my view, this is a make or break. You will not be able to sell the report without the help, without telling people that help is on the way from the state. And secondly, as I said, potentially this can be a game changer if the substance is changed, but also, as Karim pointed out earlier, 6 months have elapsed since the report has been published and nothing has happened in the meantime. So it has gone, it's off everyone's radar screen. You need now to occupy the space again, to be, very present about it, and be present in the conversation, and do the after sales service here in Lebanon, and also with the IMF, and from Harvard, from Boston. This is your responsibility to help us pitch this very valuable report to the IMF. Thank you, Karim.
Thank you, Nicolas. Just a few clarifications. Despite the passionate requests, this document has been completed. The task of the team is over. I'm sure that the team would be more than happy to contribute, sometimes to clarify, explain, and expand on the project. But I think one of the reasons of this webinar is to understand the pillars and hopefully to become having a school of thought that follows the recommendation of that paper, and for that school of thought itself to take on that baton and to run for the next marathon with the IMF and with the government. But again, thank everybody for the intervention, Dr. Ghobril and yourself. Now we're going to go to the heavy artillery that we have in our stock, and that's Dr. Ricardo Hausmann. You will have the chance of answering some of the themes that you have heard during the intervention of the discussants, and hopefully after that, I'll be able to pass on few questions of the very, very many that we have received so far. Thank you. Dr. Hausmann, the house is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Karim, for organizing this, and thank you very much, Dr. Nassib and Dr. Nicolas for your comments and discussion. Let me just say the following: the reason why we put this section on the origin of the crisis is in some sense to emphasize the fact that Lebanon was put in a situation of what we call a debt overhang. A debt overhang is when an economy has accumulated more debt than it can service. And because of a debt overhang, then the country becomes not terribly credible because everybody understands that they are over indebted. And that means interest rates remain high, people don't want to invest, growth remains lackluster, and the capacity to service that overhang debt is called into question. So we think that problem occurred in the 1990s. In fact, there were 2 Paris conferences to try to deal with the debt overhang. And the debt was only manageable while the economy was growing, particularly after the 2006 war, where the inflow of aid money and reconstruction money and so on allowed for this R minus G variable to become negative and for the country to more or less survive. But in the 2010s, R minus G became positive again, and the country could not hold it. The debt over GDP ratio was going up because the needed primary surplus that would have been required for you to avoid the debt was 4, 5, 6% of GDP, and you were nowhere near that. So I would put it to you that if we want to rebuild Lebanon, let's not rebuild Lebanon with a new debt overhang. And an economy that now must be have a GDP of less than $25 billion or so. The last number I see from the IMF was $22 billion in 2022, and it hasn't been growing. It has been some real appreciation. You cannot put on that economy $100 billion in liabilities, whichever way you want it. There's no way in which we can align the size of the economy with the size of the claims on the economy. And as a consequence, we see no way forward without paring down the claims on the economy. Now, it doesn't matter really who's at fault, whether it was the state or the this or the that. The thing is that the underpinnings to service that kind of debt has disappeared, is no longer there, does not exist. GDP has fallen by 40%, and nobody is projecting a major recovery. We need to recover. We want to recover GDP as quickly as possible. And that's why in our design, we are prioritizing early recovery. We don't want a protracted process of renegotiation of many things that precedes the recovery. We want to start with a recovery and put aside the things that will take time. That's why we're starting with the restructuring of the banking system. and the BDL and these debt certificates, so we can get the financial system operating under normal situations and the economy to start operating under normal situations, while this uncertainty over claims, these legacy claims can be resolved. Now, obviously, we all would like to minimize the necessary haircut, conditional on the economy that remains after whatever haircuts there are is a viable economy, is an economy that will not be again in a debt overhang and will be able to grow and recover. Now, I like very much the fact that Dr. Ghobril mentioned, the recent fiscal performance, but the recent fiscal performance has a primary surplus of 1.6% of GDP. In a situation where public wages are where they are, infrastructure is where it is, we need to get to what we think is 3% of GDP primary surplus. We want to get there by 2030. But in the process of going there, we need to recover state capacity. We need to recover the infrastructure. We need to recover many of the things that this period has actually undermined. And as a consequence, we really need an economy that is not overburdened with a level of debt that will make it insolvent and not credible. That's why we think that it's impossible to imagine Lebanon, for whatever political agreement there might be that against haircuts and so on, we do not see a path forward without getting the country back to a level of debt that is reasonable given the size of its economy and given the projected size of its economy. We did our numbers projecting that an economic recovery from now to 2030 and make the debt sustainable by 2030. So we are already being kind of generous in terms of the haircuts, by presuming that we are going to get to a better place in 2030, and that by 2030 we want the economy, the debt to be sustainable, because we will have supposedly by then a 3% of GDP primary surplus, something that Lebanon never had, something that Lebanon has never had. Now, if you tell me 3% of GDP as a primary surplus, that's the amount you can spend on interest payments by then, okay? You tell me what is the size of debt that you can hold then, and compare it to the size of debt now, or claims on one or the other. If the banks want their money, that is, if depositors want their money back, it means that the BDL has to be able to pay that, and that can only be if the government bails out the BDL. So then the government will have more debt to make that happen. We don't see this adding up. So as a consequence, I think that the reality is that a recovering Lebanon will need to end this debt overhang period that started with the 1990s. Without a debt overhang, we see the future of Lebanon as being much more promising. And we don't see a solution to the crisis without the elimination of the debt overhang. I want to say something about the dollar. I understand that the U.S. is perceived by some in Lebanon as not a friendly country. What we need is a credible nominal anchor. So let me throw out there an idea that's not in the report and that I have not discussed with my colleagues. So what happens if you would negotiate adopting the UAE dirham? You have the anchor, they anchor to the dollar, you anchor to them, you might have better political relations, they might grant you some financing facilities in case you get in trouble, some bailout capacity in the way that the European Central Bank has with the national central banks that you might not want to give to the US dollar. But what you're essentially after is the following idea, that if you have your own currency, that currency in a highly dollarized banking system is going to have limited credibility. Interest rates are going to remain high. If you try to denominate your debt in liras, you're going to be paying a very high interest rate. Because of dollarization, you will want to peg. So the peg plus the lack of credibility of your debt is going to translate into very high real interest rates on lira-denominated debt. And that's going to start again this spiral growth of debt that you won't be able to sustain. So that's one of the reasons why we think, and we've seen it, by the way, we've seen it in many countries. In Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan are countries that underwent, a hyperinflation crisis in the 90s. They had a dollarized banking system. Now they have both fiscal surpluses, large sovereign funds, so no debt problems, but the spread between interest on domestic currency debt, and dollar debts is huge. Is 750 basis points in Azerbaijan. It was huge in Lebanon, and that is something that you cannot afford to have in a sustainable growth process. Those were the comments I wanted to make, but I'm really eager to hear the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm sure that some of the comments that you have posited about, including a link between Lebanon and another currency than the dollar, or maybe a basket of currencies, should be things that people will think about. I'm going to make two comments before I start with the list of Q&As that we have. We have received questions with names of the parties who are putting the questions, and others without.
Sorry,
go on.
Karim, I forgot to answer one point that Dr. Chammas made about how to manage the assets of the country, the assets of the public sector. I fully support Dr. Chammas's idea on maximizing the value of what today is state-owned enterprises, whether you do PPPs and private management, whatever, maximize those values. I don't necessarily see the need of tying the recovery of deposits to whatever you do with that. I think it does not give any guarantee. I mean, it does not enhance, it does not solve the problem of it does not, that is, the problem that we have is an insolvent government. The government is currently owning those assets. If it would manage those assets better so that the value of those assets would be bigger, its insolvency will be smaller, and that's great. So let's add those considerations, etc., to what we think can be the haircut that is needed to make the country solvent. But I don't see what is gained by those depositors in getting on the risk of underperforming in this process. So I'm fully supportive of the process. I think the country needs a much better management of its assets, but I don't necessarily think it's wise to tie that to the recovery of deposits by people in the banking system. We want the banking system cleaned as quickly as possible so that it operates as a normal banking system. And those claims, to be resolved one way or another sooner rather than later. And definitely, let's make the state as solvent as possible by managing its assets in the most productive way possible. And I think Dr. Chammas has great ideas in that respect.
Thank you, Ricardo, for being comprehensive in your answer about all the intervention of the discussants. I'd like to take a minute and say two things before we start the Q&A session, which are questions submitted in writing to us throughout this seminar. Some people have sent their names with the questions, others have not. So I'm going to be respectful of everybody, and we'll have a question on an anonymous basis. And this way, people won't feel being put on the spot and others not. Two, we are going to group some of the questions that have almost the same themes. So I would like to apologize in advance for those who had put several questions that come all together under the same umbrella of a subject, and we will try to shoot them at Ricardo in batches. So the first batch has to do with the dollarization, and most of the questions that we have received on the dollarizations are questions about sovereignty of the government, the role of the BDL, and a very pertinent question saying if your plan is going to encourage the recovery from a fiscal revenue for the government, and the BDL would be managing a much more reasonable amount of debt. So why lose the sovereignty for the central bank? Why don't you do this and then keep that possibility? Another question also under the umbrella of the dollars is that even if we keep the dollar pegged to the Lebanese pound at a very high rate of Lebanese pound, it still gives the government the possibility in the future to be able to reclaim that real estate, which is the local currency, as part of its sovereignty gauge. So again, questions that have to do more with the sovereignty and the role of the BDL than with the direct effect on revenues for the government. So I'd like to lead with that question on the dollarization. If you could just give us your views about the necessity and maybe certain examples of other countries who have done it and who have not been invaded by the US. And again, please keep out of your answer any political considerations. Some people like the US, some people don't like the US, some people don't like themselves in Lebanon. So that's something we're not going to be dealing with today. It's going to take too much time and too much of frigid analysis. But on the dollarization, if you could tell us a bit more of your views, why this is an absolute urgency at this stage.
Ugo, I answered the previous questions, but I don't know if you want to come in first now.
Go ahead, Ricardo. Then if I have something to add, I will intervene.
Okay. Well, I mean, let me say, the idea that if we solve all the problems, we can keep the peg, and then that gives us a degree of flexibility. The point that we make, number one, is that a peg doesn't give you that much flexibility. If the peg is credible, you don't have monetary policy. You have the same interest rate as whatever interest rate is in the country you peg to. And so it doesn't buy you any monetary independence. It buys you the possibility of abandoning the peg. But because it gives you the possibility of abandoning the peg, and your citizens know that, your citizens charge you for that in a spread between the dollar interest rates and the lira interest rates. And we think that that spread is going to be high, and it's going to worsen your solvency. So that's why we think you're buying a level of, you're not buying much monetary autonomy. You're buying sort of like the privilege to abandon the peg in the future at a very, very high cost. That is probably going to derail and slow down your recovery. Now, I want to say again, what you really want is a credible nominal anchor. And, if it's if you get into a monetary agreement with either the UAE or the Saudis or both or whatever countries that peg to a dollar, your banking system is dollarized already. So it's a choice of the Lebanese. But if somebody wants to provide some other financial services attached to that peg commitment, I think it's something to be explored. I think that the issues of political sovereignty are legitimate, and what we're trying to solve is a financial problem. And if it can be solved in a way that minimizes the political noise, I think so much the better.
Thank you.
Can I quickly add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to say the same thing that Ricardo said, might be using another language. So you might think, exactly as the question, you might think that one of the advantages of not dollarizing is that you have an option. So if you think in terms of finance, you are buying a call option, right? That's at some point you might want to use. And the point, if you do finance, you're going to buy an option if the price is right. And a way of saying what Ricardo, this option seems to be incredibly expensive. So it's probably not worth buying. So that's maybe I don't know. That's an analogy, which is the same thing that Ricardo said.
Okay, I'm going to move to another theme of grouped questions, and they have to do with the nature of the securities that will be issued in exchange of the liabilities that were moved from the balance sheets of the banks and the central bank to the balance sheet of the government per se. And I remember when I read myself the paper at the beginning, probably in its, in its final version, I was very excited about the fact that these kind of certificates could have a market. It's better than having nothing. It could trade up or down. It definitely creates some kind of demand. The question that I have, there is a garden variety of these instruments that we've seen around the world. Some of the questions talk about asset-backed or income-backed receivables from the government. Nicolas talked about, enhancing the value of the underlying state-owned monopolies or the assets of the government. Others are talking about perpetual bonds. If these assets are recovering and they are in a healthy situation, and as you know, most of the assets we are talking about are in a monopoly or a near monopoly position, and therefore their revenues in the future in a normalized economy is almost assured. So what would you see as the most efficient nature? I'm sorry, I'm going now into which I promised myself not to go into a granular detail of your big plan, but what have you seen in other countries? Because always having examples of other places, Argentina or other places that have had crisis, what could be, if you'd like, the most efficient and comfortable piece of paper that could be given to depositors, knowing two things: knowing that they have been bitten, from their deposits in the bank, and they've been bitten by the haircut, whatever that is. Even a 50% haircut is already a very severe haircut, and if it's 90% or 80%, that becomes devastating. And two, knowing that the counterpart that they have, which is the government, is not changing and hasn't changed its policies or its actors for the past 30 to 40 years. So what could be, if you'd like, if you had a wishful possibility of putting a structure together, the nature of these receivables? Would you think about them as being preferred shares, bonds? Should they be backed by assets? Should they be backed by income? What could make them more attractive and over time probably gain in value, and therefore that haircut that people are complaining about at the present time becomes gradually better as the underlying value of the assets enhances and as these papers become more marketable in the market?
Sure. First of all, the certificates we propose to issue are really like claims to a negotiation. What we're doing is separating the claims people currently have on banks into claims of a negotiation that will have to be made to restructure all of the government's debts, because the BDL is in default and the government is in default. Everybody there is in default, right? So the question is, how is this mix of things going to be allocated with a new set of instruments? At the end of the process, there will be a new set of instruments, a new level of debt, a new set of instruments that will come out of that negotiation. The certificates are not that final instrument. The certificates are just a ticket to the negotiation, where everybody goes to a negotiation with a certain rights that have to be attributed. Okay? Now, in previous renegotiations, let me say a few things. Number one, banks typically of different countries, of different jurisdictions, have had some preferences for haircuts, some preference for protecting the nominal value of the debt. So you can protect the nominal value of the debt by having a lower interest rate, and some jurisdictions prefer that, but they are typically made equal in net present value terms. So everybody comes out with debts that are equal in net present value terms, and there are different ways of getting to that similarity of net present values. They often typically are calculated to have the same net present value, and people are given a set of options, a menu of options, and they decide which ones they prefer. And the governments and the financial advisors of the governments try to make sure that it's not an obvious choice, that the five are responding to, or the three or the five or whatever options are responding to people's preferences, tax treatments in their home countries, or whatever the consideration might be. I want to an argument that is often made, and this is to a point that Dr. Gibran had made earlier. There's always the question of, if I do a haircut, even a very big haircut, will that not destroy the reputation of the country? And now the country will never be able to go back again to financial markets because it has this bad past? Or is it that if you do a big haircut, now you're more solvent, and investors that are forward-looking are saying now it's a clearer case of recovery because it doesn't have that debt overhang, and a lot of money flows back in? I think that the evidence, and Hugo has done more work on this than I have, the evidence suggests that the bigger the haircut, the faster the subsequent recovery. And even a country as messy as Argentina, after they finalized their debt restructuring, the government was able to issue a $100 bond, 100-year bond, a year or two after the end of the restructuring. So I would say markets are forward-looking, and they're going to want to see a solvent country, and that solvency is going to be enhanced by magnitude of the haircut. Now, the general perception, it was popular in many for a while, that you would give investors what they call value recovery instrument, or a value recovery mechanism. Okay, so yes, I get a big haircut, but if then the economy recovers more and it's doing well, I get a little bit more. The general perception is that markets undervalue these value recovery mechanisms, that the market is not enamored of them, that they don't add much to this optionality. This is not terribly valued markets, and it ends up being expensive at no real benefit for the first guys who receive it. But Hugo, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
No, basically you said everything. Maybe the only thing that we could add, that there is research mostly by Carmen, and Carmen Reinhardt is one of our authors in the report, which shows that when there is this menu of tools, countries tend to do better when the choice is more for face value reduction. For any given NPV adjustment, face value reduction tends to be more conducive to growth that haircuts of the same amount, but which are done through maturity extension or no interest rate. So Carmen has some work on this with Christoph Trebesch.
Thank you. Thank you both, Hugo and Ricardo. I'm going to go now to the third batch of questions. And here I think, you could allocate the answer to either of you as you like. What we've seen from the questions that have been submitted to us is that on one side, the paper is being, I won't say the word criticized, but viewed as being too lenient on the government. And it says here that you have limited the amount of recovery of the debts of the deposits, I'm sorry, to 100 to 150. And again, this is an illustrative figure. You're not in a position to say 100 or 150. You're not the deciders, but you are presenting it. Two, you are moving the debt onto the government and then given the haircut of 90%. So in fact, the government having already been saved, as Dr. Ghobril has said, by the inflation, its debt has shrunk naturally without even that haircut that they're suggesting. And the only thing that the government is going to do is to be put into a straitjacket for them to become good boys, to behave well with the IMF, and to agree to some reforms. And one of the questions is saying that this is like saying that giving a diet for somebody who's obese is not the penalty to that patient. In fact, it is the cure for the patient. But if you look at from that argumentation, no economic woes, no economic, I hate to use the word that Dr. Chammas also has mentioned, losses, are being piled onto the government. Only the government is having its debt ledger disappearing, by 80 to 90%. They are going to get money from the IMF, and therefore most of the burden is going to be shouldered by the private sector, including banks and depositors. Now, in that same vein, and that's why I said the question could be answered, or the set of questions, by both panelists at your will. The other one says, no, this paper has been extremely lenient on the banks because the banks are going to get money from the BDL. We understood, and thank you for the clarification that this is not free money, to recapitalize, whereby they should be bringing their own capital because they have taken dividends over all these years. They have stashed money in Switzerland, and maybe not. Maybe Switzerland is becoming too hot for them. They're putting it somewhere else. Let them bring their own money. The government should not bail them out. This is not free money from the taxpayers. You've been nice with the banks because you're capitalizing them. You're giving them a chance to recover. And in fact, their clients, which are the depositors, have no choice but to come back to them because, as you said at the beginning, an economy cannot work without banks. So these are two extreme positions that I have tried to streamline from the set of questions. One of them is saying the government is getting scot-free out of this and only going into a situation where it should behave as such from the beginning. So no big deal. On the other one, it's saying, no, the banks are getting it scot-free because we are reintrusting them with the fiduciary duty that they have had towards the depositors. And maybe here there is a distinction to be made in people's questions and people's minds between bankers and banks, which sometimes people mingle together. I am of the school that says if a banker has been accused or is responsible of fraud, scienter, or any kind of misbehaving, that party should pay, but not the institution. So have you been too lenient on the banks? Have you been too lenient on the governments? Have you been too lenient on both? So this is, if you'd like, the basket of questions I have on that theme.
So let me start with the banks, the too lenient on banks. And here we had a very interesting, here we had an interesting discussion in the team. And the question was, okay, let's look at the option of saying, look, banks are broke, let's wipe them out. Let's take them over, because we wipe it out, the bankers lose their property. They're taken over by the government, and the government is going to sell them off or run. And in the meantime, it's going to run them, and eventually it's going to sell them off. To be able to sell them off, they'll have to show, what are the assets, the liabilities, etc., for people to go and submit bids, etc. We think that process will take at least 2 years. And it will delay the recovery by that time. You will be left without a banking system where everybody's trying to assess, do these forensic analysis of what's there, what's not there. And the people who are running the banks will be taken out of the picture. And as you take them out of the picture, a lot of the knowledge, the know-how, the reputational connections is taken out, and you no longer have an ongoing concern. So we thought that relative to that, what we are doing is we are wiping out a significant chunk of the equity of banks, because we're having banks take on 10% of the $70-some billion in certificates we are issuing. So the banks are going to have those, they're going to participate in the haircut. Our calculation is that will leave the banking system as a whole with positive equity. But because also we are taking the deposits down by 70 billion or thereabouts, the need for equity of this much smaller banking system will have declined in line with a reduction of equity that we're putting in banks and that we're causing the banks to have. So we're leaving the banks with enough capital on average to operate, and we're assuring the public, not the banks, we're assuring the public that their money is in a bank that has sufficient equity. Our concern is not how nice we are to the bankers. Our concern is how credible are the banks vis-a-vis their depositors? Are the banks sufficiently capitalized? So our formula will leave a sufficiently capitalized banking system that does not have to go through receivership, long auditing processes, and then bidding processes, and then I don't know who on the government side is going to be managing those banks while this process is happening. And it's quite a few banks that the government will have to manage if it puts them into receivership. So we thought, let's keep the banks leadership and ownership structure as it is. Let's pare down the equity of the banks while the size of the banking system shrinks with this transfer of liabilities. And let's tell the public that the bank has enough equity by giving this subordinated loan to the banks. And it's subordinated loans in a fairly kind of disciplined way, so that the banks, the main role of the bankers is that if they want to keep their bank, they will have to really either recapitalize it, retain earnings, run it well, etc., to have a banking system that is under discipline constraints, but that can help the economy recover. So that's why we ended up where we ended on the banks. On the government, a lot of the discussion talks of the government as if it was a separate player, as if it was an independent actor, and so on. The main asset of the government and the asset with which it's going to pay anything is the net present value of its taxes. Whenever you leave more money on the banks, on the government, more debt on the government, you're essentially committing more of net present value of future taxes to servicing the debt. So, and that means that if there's some limit to the capacity of the government to raise taxes, and now we've applauded the government for raising taxes to 15% of GDP, and that was one of the reasons why the IMF wanted the official rate to go from 15 to 89, so that the VAT and customs taxes and so on are paid at the new exchange rate, and that would recover revenues for the government. In the end, the government is going to pay everything we give it, not with the money they have, but with the money they will collect from the Lebanese people. Okay, that's why in that sense, we shouldn't imagine it as if they had a different source of money. The source of money is the rest of the citizens of the country. Given the needs for recovery, given the needs, to have a functioning state, to have a state with a functioning infrastructure, we thought we cannot, we have to consider a government that needs to accompany the recovery by the private sector with the needed public infrastructure. There are many circumstances in which the private sector does not want to invest because the infrastructure to support that investment is not there. So we think that the recovery of state capacities will crowd in private investment. And without it, a major recovery of private investment is hard to imagine. Now, that investment might be done with PPPs, with more efficient structures, etc. But you have to create fiscal space for that to happen. So, bottom line, we are asking the government to be able to generate a 3 percentage points primary surplus. And we're anchoring the whole program, the whole fiscal adjustment, on the government being able to get to 3% primary surplus, something that Lebanon has never done in its history, okay? That is the amount of effort we are placing on the government. And the rest is simply financial engineering of how do we make the level of obligations of the government consistent with a 3% primary surplus. And we are delaying that 3% primary surplus to 2030. And we're asking for transitional finance so that we can help the government recover, that is the infrastructure recover, the health system recover, the education system recover, so that by 2030, we're servicing 3% of GDP to all these claims that have been accumulated through history on the government.
Okay. I have two more questions because I'm also very cognizant of the time and everybody is a bit wary of their own schedule. One has to do with the sectors of the growth. I have a question very dear to my heart, asked by somebody very dear to me, and your answer will dictate whether I come home in one piece or not, or get home in one piece or not. So the question is about the education. In your growth sectors, there have been little mention about how important, the education or investment in education is going to be important for the future, be it technical or professional schools, secondary or primary. A country that used to boast its literary levels in a way to differentiate itself from its neighboring countries seem to have sunk below that level. And do you think that and if you can give us examples, that would be great, whereby the education or investments therein or incentives by the government on education, be it fiscal, holidays or whatever, with respect to educational investments, would be of help to the growth sectors that you highlighted in your paper.
Well, first of all, Lebanon is the poster child of a country that has generated much more human capital than the other things that are needed for growth. And that human capital has decided that it's much more productive outside of Lebanon than in Lebanon. And that's why you have one of the most distinguished diasporas in the world. And you run half the countries in Latin America. But you
said we run or we rob. I didn't hear you well.
You run. No, I mean, you have an amazingly distinguished diaspora, and half of the Gulf is run with Lebanese talent, because you've had historically a very good educational system. My understanding is that with the crisis, the government has been able to pay symbolic salaries, and that people have been looking for options. That's why we think it's very important that the basic functions of government be covered, so that you don't lose this thing that you know how to do well, which is education. Okay. We think that asset, since it's such a long duration asset, people work until their 70s and so on, it can be part of a comparative advantage of the country going forward. And that's why we think that the export of high-skilled services can become an engine of growth. So I think, and I fully agree with the need for the government to make sure that in its spending priorities, it puts sufficient priority to the recovery of the educational system, and that the growth strategy benefit from the previous investments in human capital that are expressed in the countries, and the endowment in the level of education of the Lebanese population in general, whether they are in Lebanon or outside of Lebanon.
Thank you. Two quick questions. So I said one, but they're going to be very, very quick. One is that, Dr. Panizza, would you be able, and would it be possible for you to share with us your slides, so some of the people who have attended would have the benefit of reading them in a summarized form and in a succinct way as you've put them? And I see that you're nodding, so I take that for a yes. Thank you very much. The last question is not really a question. It's an introspective cry that I've seen in 17 questions out of 50 that we have received. And do you really believe that these guys are going to implement the reforms that you're looking to do? And that's not a question to you, but maybe you could share with us in Latin America, in developing markets mainly, and not developed markets, what has been the change that led to a willful execution and implementation? Was it a dictator that came and implemented that? Was it a whole change of the political class? I mean, usually most of these morasses that you have overseen in Latin America and other places have been done by successive governments, and it's almost incestuous. They're all the same. So what has happened? Again, forget you giving us a panacea about Lebanon. I think that God has given up on that. But if you can give us some examples and some instances of other countries, in Latin America or developed countries, what was the prerequisite, the political prerequisite, for us to come almost to terms with a class or a political class that will be able to implement? What did anything happen before that implementation occurred? Did a drastic political change happen before? Thank you.
I must say there are more successful stabilizations going from dictatorship to democracy than the other way around. So you know, what essentially happens in a successful stabilization is that the previous system led to a crisis that people find unbearable. And right now, I would say you lost 40% of your GDP. If you resolve the crisis, you can get, there's a lot of upside potential, right? So in a democracy, those that can credibly offer a solution of how to get to that upside potential have a possibility of winning elections and so on. So the current president of Argentina, the basic promise that he made is that he was going to destroy whatever needed to be destroyed, fix whatever needed to be fixed to bring inflation down. But that these unsustainable claims on the government and these huge fiscal deficits funded with money printing was going to stop. And he won the election on that basis. He kind of like promised blood, sweat, and tears, but that he was going to stop the current situation. And that was a sort of political success, whatever macroeconomic success he may or may not have in the future, that remains to be seen. But in terms of a situation becoming very, very disappointing, people suffering significantly from the current situation, and a clear opportunity for recovery. And I'm really amazed at the fact that it's been, 4 years now since at least the start of the official start of the crisis, if you want, and it has not been painful enough to move the society into an agreement on a solution. I think in part it is because the status quo, all these people who don't want haircuts and so on are getting zero, right? And the government is not servicing any of those debts. So in some sense, a resolution of a crisis would involve people acknowledging that something is better than nothing, and now they're getting nothing, and that the government won't be able just to be running on not paying any debt whatsoever. So I think that there has to be a political movement that credibly convinces the Lebanese population, the Lebanese citizen, that they're committed to a course of action that will improve their lives, I know nothing about Lebanese politics, but it's this belief that there is a better place, there is a promised land, and that you don't have to live in the desert. There is a way to get to the promised land, and those that want to keep you in the desert, shouldn't get your vote.
Sure.
You want people who will take you to the promised land.
Yeah, I mean, we're champions in that. Don't worry. We usually follow false prophets. I'm sorry, there are some questions that came at the last minute. We can't pose them anymore. We have to stop and pause the webinar. I would like to thank both Hugo and Ricardo to be with us, Nicolas and Nassib to be with us, and most importantly, all of the attendees these secret soldiers who have been coming and posing questions. Some of them are up at early hours, others are up at late times with us, and we thank them all to be with us. We thank you again for the paper. And again, to wrap it up, this is something that we think should be viewed as a very constructive roadmap for the recovery of Lebanon's economy. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you.
night.